We hid a hunter's secret in 1995. 25 years later, something the world had been trying to erase came back to my door and asked me why. When people ask me how a life gets tangled up with something like that, a thing you might call impossible if you'd only read about it in a paper or seen it in some grainy video, I go back to a single night when the highway was a white ribbon and my truck was a dim silhouette in the snow. You learn to measure the world by small things. The sound a tailgate makes when it slams, the way a radio puts out a steady hum, the warmth a pair of wool gloves can hold. That night, all those small things were the difference between walking away and carrying something home. It was 1974. I was still young enough to think I was indestructible and old enough to already know the woods could kill you if you made one wrong choice. I worked as a radio tech for the Forest Service then, which is a polite way of saying I fixed radios and guided lost hunters and listened to weather reports until the frequency bled into my bones. The C-10 I drove was a 1971, with rust in the wheel wells and slick leather that had been heated so many times it smelled of sweat and motor oil. On nights like that, I'd leave the radio on and the heater low and let the static be company. The blizzard came quick. You could drive through a town in clear weather, and then the next ridge would be a whiteout. I remember thinking the road was the skin of the world, thin and shredded by wind. I was following an emergency beacon that had tripped somewhere on a logging road when I saw it. A puff of motion, a small shape half buried at the ditch, not bigger than a child. At first I thought it was a kid, the coat, the way the little face poked through snow like a frostbitten frog. But up close, the face was wrong and right at the same time. The ears were set differently, broad and soft. The hands had a padded look, like someone had made mittens out of moss. One leg was snapped at the thigh, and the snow had crusted into the fur. The thing was breathing hard, eyes like oil-wet river stones, and when I scooped it into the truck, it gave a sound that was almost a sob. I should have left it. There are 100 cautious reasons: diseases, predators, the danger of interfering. But there's a point where your hands move before your mind has time to argue. And that winter, those hands put a wool blanket around a small, shivering body and drove back to town with a heater that smelled faintly of bread and antifreeze. We nursed it in a shed behind my parents' house for 2 weeks. I couldn't take it to a vet. Vets don't patch broken femurs and things they can't name. So I used what I had. I made a splint out of paint stirrers and canvas tape, wrapped it in an old sheet, and set a little stove outside the door to keep the cold from creeping in. I kept a transistor radio on in the corner. The first night I put a record on, a Carole King record my sister had left, and watched, half empty and half mesmerized, as this small creature turned his head toward the music. He learned the rhythms faster than a human infant. He hummed back like a low chord. When I brought him broth and bread, he would touch my hand with a small, calloused finger and curl it shut. The gesture was so close to a child's that my throat constricted. I called him Little Bit because there was nothing else to call him, and because in a world of names it was the least presumptuous. He had a broken leg and a quiet, careful way about him, sharp-eyed and wary, but curious enough to follow me into the rooms where the light came in. For 2 weeks we kept a simple schedule: food, warmth, the radio, the record player. He learned to sit on a crate and listen. He learned the cadence of the weather report. When I tuned the radio and a human voice threaded through static, his head would tilt and he'd make a sound that wasn't quite a word, but that matched the human syllables enough that I could imagine understanding. He never learned speech the way a child does. He learned it like a man remembering a language he'd been taught long ago, picking out useful pieces and hanging them on his own silence. That winter felt like stealing time from the world. When my sister came by with a casserole and an awkward laugh, I tucked Little Bit behind a curtain and told a small lie. When a neighbor dropped in and asked about tracks near the creek, I swore I'd seen nothing. There's a strip of your moral life where you can stand and look both ways. That winter, I stood nearly all the way across. 2 weeks after I found him, Little Bit was strong enough to walk when I supported him. He never stopped being other, but he stopped being merely a thing you might photograph on the side of a road. He had preferences and dislikes. He liked the Carole King record and the way it made the lamplight buzz softly. He wanted to touch the knobs of my radio with those patient fingers. He would imitate the shape of letters with his hands while staring at them the way a man studies the grain of wood. Then, as quietly as he had arrived, he left. One dawn, he was gone. No note, no indication, just an empty crate and a little circle of knots left where his hair had been. I searched the nearby ridge, hollered until my throat burned, but you can't track something that doesn't want to be found. It's the sort of thing you file under unanswerable, a memory to be kept as carefully as you keep the first coin from your child's pocket. I did not tell a soul. For 20 years, that secret lived in my chest like a carved bone. It wasn't something to brag about. It was something to hold in case I ever needed to be reminded that the world still made room for strange mercy. If you like long-form witness stories, subscribe. After that winter, life moved the way it always had, slow with sudden turns. I met Sarah at a potluck in a church basement when I was 28 and reckless enough to try a dance. She had a laugh that didn't try to fit into a room, and a patience that could iron out the edge of any of my anxieties. We married under a gray sky and bought a little clapboard house with a porch that creaked like a tired hinge. We had 2 kids, Emma, who kept a notebook full of pressed maple leaves, and Jake, who could disassemble a radio by the time he was 8 and put it back together with all the screws in the right holes. My work remained the kind that keeps your name small and your hands necessary. I fixed radios, I maintained trails, I checked beacons, and marked hazard points on topo maps. The forest is generous and indifferent. It gives you firewood and fog, and, if you're lucky, long stretches of silence where you can think something clear. I started a modest habit of leaving 1 extra meal at the ranger station for whoever needed it. Some things about me stayed the same. I kept the radio frequency numbers in my head like phone numbers. I still warmed my hands on the steering wheel before I started the truck in the mornings. And sometimes, on clear nights when the radio was quiet, I would lift a record and listen to the scratch of a needle and let my mind drift back to a small hand that had once curled mine. Over the years, the town changed slowly. A lumber company put up a processing plant farther up the valley. Roads that had been 2 seasons of ruts were paved and named. Houses sprung up in cleared patches where fir had once stood shoulder to shoulder. People called it progress. Habitats shrank in the same slow way a shoreline disappears when the tide is persistent. I watched the topo maps change in my drawer, new lines crossing old ones, new coordinates written in a different ink. 2 decades after I found that small wincing thing in the ditch, a familiar weight settled into my life. But this time it was different. Little Bit returned, not small and frightened, but grown into something that made my breath catch. He was the height of a man, broad in the shoulders, fur as dark as the floor of the deepest ravine. He walked with the kind of deliberation you see in animals that weigh the worth of every step. When I opened the back door and saw him in the light of an evening that had the last of autumn's chill, my first instinct was to back away, to let the door fall and forget I'd ever seen a thing like that. My hands did not obey. We had never stopped sending a quiet sort of signal to each other, as if the small radio in my head still hummed with the threads of that old winter. He came with an elder trailing behind him, a presence that moved like a wind over stone. The elder's face was lined beyond human counting. He had the kind of eyes that seemed to hold a place's weather in them. There was a woman close by with an infant tucked at her hip. Their movements were careful, practiced around the edges of human proximity, like people who have learned to borrow light without asking. Little Bit's voice, when it came, was like the memory of a tune. Not many words, but the words he used were precise enough. He said my name the way someone might say the name of a person they trusted with a story. Little Bit's English was economical. The elder didn't speak much to me directly. Instead, Little Bit did the translating. Short lines, the kind of thing a child uses when they want to keep the important parts simple. "We are dying in pieces," he said. "Hunters come, machines come. We cannot hear, need shelter for winter." He told me their numbers were few, and that the oldest had trouble with winter like the rest of us. There had been killings, he said, not stories to be spread, but the sort that leave a particular stony grief. He mentioned 1995 like it was a wound you tape down but cannot heal. That winter, when a stretch of their range had been opened by a new road, and hunters had come in numbers they had not seen before. The elder, whom he called Ash, had been wounded. A mother named Morning had lost kin. There was a child, Reed, not more than a year by my reckoning, who could not yet walk. I remember sitting on the porch steps while the light slid down the hill. Sarah stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hand. She had that look you get when the world's math changes by one unknown variable, and you have to decide whether it fits into your plans. I felt like a man with a ledger that had been crossed out. This is where I have to say it plainly. For the structure of this telling, I'm doing what I'll call a timeline shift. The rescue in '74 is the origin story, but the secret that gets hidden, the wet, dangerous thing that needed cover, happens in 1995, when Little Bit returned as an adult and asked for shelter. 25 years after that winter, in 2020, there is another knock at my door. That later knock is an accounting of sorts, and how I answer it matters. But for now, in the moment I'm describing, winter is leaning in, and the choices are immediate and simple and excruciating. You always think you'll find a third option when push comes to shove. You imagine a plan you can live with. You'll tell a trusted neighbor who will keep the secret. You'll move them to some public land nobody will look at. You'll make a farmstead of lies if it means safety. None of those choices existed in the clear way I wanted. The real choices were blunt. Refuse and watch them wither in a widening world they could not survive in, or say yes and drag my family into a secret that would make every breath feel like theft. I remember Little Bit's hands. He set his palm on my knee, and the skin of his thumb was worn to a dullness like a pewter spoon. His eyes were not pleading, they were stating facts. "Shelter," he said. "One winter, we keep quiet." There are things a man promises before he knows the cost. I promised. Sarah was angry the way someone who loves fiercely but fears Pierre everything can be. She wanted to know why I hadn't told her immediately, why I would consider shielding a stranger in the summer, only to hide one of a different species in the winter. She argued, with a spicy mix of pragmatism and disbelief, that this would ruin our lives if it went wrong. I argued, too, about ethics and the rightness of sheltering a dying thing. We argued like all married people do in the small hours about whether A, B, or C would keep the kids safe. In the end, she asked a question that was sharper than any sermon. How will you explain to Emma and Jake that you let people kill what could have been saved? There's no liturgy for that. There's only a stove and a packed feed bag and a winter to face. Sarah, who had a way of folding her anger into action, put down the dish towel and came out to help. That's the part that still surprises people when I tell it. The woman who could have walked away instead filled the insulated coolers with food, wrapped blankets in plastic, and helped me stack canned goods under the stairs. She watched Little Bit with the same quiet study that had watched me for years. In the end, she did not say yes as much as she accepted the necessity of the choice. We decided to use the shed behind the shop. It was walled with old boards and had been insulated with straw in the '70s by a man who liked to tinker. It had a second floor where you could stack hay or feed. We refitted the place with a wood stove that took a while to warm but kept heat like a patience. I dug out an old trove of camping gear, waxed tarps, an army mess kit, extra thermoses. We set up a false wall of tools and lumber so that a quick inspection would return only a pile of harmless junk. Maps became our catechism. I spread out topo sheets on the kitchen table and traced roots with my finger until the skin on my fingertip reddened. I marked 2 escape paths and 1 drop point where I'd left caches during summer scouting. I made a list in a handwriting that trembled with responsibility. Food, water purification tablets, medical tape, splints. There is a particular kind of silence when a list becomes a covenant. For weeks, we ferried supplies under the honest excuse of running errands. I loaded the '71 Chevy with wood and dog food and a child's sled, and I told the kids we were just tidying the shed for winter. Reed, the infant, slept swaddled in the crook of Morning's arm when I brought a sewing kit, and when the night came, I would sit with Little Bit by the stove and hand him a cup of tea that tasted like bark and sugar. He never drank exactly like a person. He tilted his head and sipped, the way someone tests an idea for fit. Elder Ash told stories in the hours when neither of us thought heat would hold forever. He had a voice that sounded like the bottom of a stream, quiet, patient, carrying sediment. Little Bit would translate in clipped bursts, his accent tight around simple words. Ash's stories were not boastful myths. They were a census of memory. He spoke of summers before roads, of kin living in hollowed groves, of a slow, steady narrowing of the spaces they could call safe. He talked about names people gave them, names colored by fear or amusement, and the weight of being observed like an animal in a glass case. What I heard beneath the stories was grief shaped by time. One night, Ash told a tale about a river that had been wide as a town when his grandmother was young. He described a crossing where you could see the bones of the riverbed like a palm. Little Bit would pause as he translated, and I learned to listen not only for the content of the tale, but for the pauses, the breaths between words that carried as much meaning as the sentences. It was in those pauses that you could feel the years press into him. We set rules. No leaving during daylight, no talking to anyone about who came to the shed, no fires in the open. We built caches on the far ridge with hand-laid markers only we would know. We hid music under floorboards, a Carole King disc, an old bluegrass tape. Music, in a house that had been mostly practicality for so long, became a kind of theology. The creatures responded to it in ways that bent me quiet. Little Bit would sit with palms on his knees while the needle slid and the room breathed with remembered phrases of melody, and for a moment the house was not ours alone. Winter moved in slowly and then all at once. The first snow was like a curtain pulled over the valley. The second came with a wind that sounded like a wagon train of dry leaves. I worked double shifts at the ranger office and then snuck to the shed with the excuse of checking trail markers. Sarah taught Morning how to scrub dishes and preserve a roast in cold air. Emma and Jake were given a simple rule: never go near the shed and never, ever accept anything from strangers without asking us first. The kids took the rule with the sleepy acceptance of children who think their parents' worries are part of the scenery. Days blurred into a sanctified routine. I'd wake before light, warm the stove, bring a thermos of coffee and a stack of blankets. Little Bit would stand in the low doorway, a silhouette that caught the tallow of the morning, and offer a small, measured smile. He was no longer a child. He was the kind of adult whose movements suggested a lifetime of knowing how to survive. He would grunt a phrase, "We are grateful," and the words felt like a benediction. There were, of course, close calls. One afternoon, a logging crew pushed a bit further than was polite and left a trail of tracks that headed toward the ridge we used for caches. I remember my heart climbing into my throat and my hands moving on map lines as if trying to erase them. A bulldozer's rumble in the distance has a way of making you feel like a small animal. We shifted goods. We moved the child further back. We poured resin into jars and marked them, as if to confuse anyone who might find them by accident. The town did not sleep. People talked about new permits and the economic boost the plant had promised. Hunters boasted about trophy lines and rifles like they bore merit badges. You could feel the town's comfort in fences and new roofs, and the sense that the land was there for taking, not asking. Occasionally, I'd see a young man at the bar with pockets full of bravado and a map app bright in his hand, and I'd feel old and foolish. There are simple, aching moments when you see the world as two different things at once. One set of people who accept profit as fate, another set whose lives are quietly being pushed into narrow, dark places. The more I delivered supplies, the smaller my excuses grew. The more Littlebit told me of his people's dwindling spaces, the more the math of the situation reversed. This was not theft, it was repayment. We were trading our quiet nights for the act of saving a life that someone else had endangered. That is the kind of moral arithmetic that sits neatly in the dark. Give up comfort to preserve dignity. Then came the day when the wind changed direction and something else moved into the margin of my worry. A neighbor, Dale Morrison, who ran trail rides in the summer and had lost half his patience to bourbon, came by to borrow a chainsaw. He was a man who had seen the valley like his own yard and believed in taking. He and I had traded tools and weather for years. I told him I'd lend the saw next week. He left muttering about bad timing. Dale's truck disappeared around the bend, and I watched the tracks flatten the fresh snow. I had a sense, the kind your body gives you before your mind catches up, that a small, unpleasant thing had been set in motion. The ridge the caches sat on was in Dale's habit of riding. He knew every cheat line and deer path. We had fortressed the shed the best we could, but forts are only as good as the wall you can make, and the luck you still have. That night, I sat by the stove longer than usual and listened to the tape of a song until the needle found the groove and the needle hiked me backwards to a 20-year-old man who'd once kept a creature alive with a paint stirrer and a prayer. There were nights when Littlebit would stand at the window and look out like a man who communed with the line of trees. Once, in the low dark, he whispered a question through me. Will they be safe? It was not an accusation. It was a simple calculation of what my life could hold. I would answer as a man can. We'll try. The word try carries more weight than a promise in a winter's hush. The cold bit deeper. I sealed gaps with cloth and a sticky hand. We rationed flour and set aside a small coil of matches for emergencies. Reed laughed once, and the sound was a small shock of joy. Morning cupped the infant's head like a practice of prayer. Elder Ash sat on an upturned crate and traced his finger along the contour of a map I'd laid out and told of a crossing that had once been wide as a town. The stories comforted us when the wind scraped the edges of our courage. But a secret is a living thing. It breathes and grows and exudes heat. It leaves traces. When it is kept under the roof of a man with a job that requires him to be known in town, the secret will leave footsteps on the snow. You can hide the goods, you can mute the music, you can teach a child to watch and not tell, but there's always something that will make the sky change color and startle the birds. One late afternoon, as I drove back from the ranger station with a load of blankets, I saw a smear on the road that made me stop. It was not big, only a smear of something dark, like oil on white paper, and it lay at the edge of the lane where a hawk might have left a mark. My stomach went sour. I filled the truck bed with a weighty, useless silence and drove the last mile in less than careful gears. When I arrived at the house, Sarah met me in the yard with a face grown too stern for domestic use. Dale stopped by, she said he saw tracks, said they were like nothing he's seen. My heart thudded a physical alarm. I thought of the odometer on the truck, the dogs that might bark at wrong things, the children bringing school friends home and asking what a bear-sized shadow might be. It is one thing to keep a secret when you are the only one who carries it. It is another to shoulder it in a town where men sip beer and trade stories like currency. We took another inventory. We moved the smallest caches deeper and scattered dog food where a curious nose might find it and then be satisfied. Little Bit would watch the street with a patient dignity and an intensity that made me feel as if he could see the world's future in a footprint. And yet, even in the tightening, there were small mercies. A carved figure left on the windowsill one morning, smooth and dark and small as a thumb. It was not a sign of challenge, it was a token. Reed would press his hand against it with a child's amusement and then turn away. We took the figure and set it on a shelf where the light could hit it and remind us why we had decided to be thieves of comfort. So the shed held and the winter folded over us like a heavy quilt. The days were routine, supply runs, tending the stove, listening to Ash's stories. But every night my sleep was shallow with the prickling worry of possible discovery. You live with the sense that an ordinary man's life is a thin glass bowl, and someone walking by with a broom could nick it. That fear can become prayerful. It can make you measure your words. In the late hours of a night that smelled of iron and the coming of snow, I remember standing at the edge of the porch with Carole King whispering on a record somewhere inside, and Little Bit beside me, tall against the low stars. He pointed up at the clear arc of sky, and then at me, and in his few words, the ones he used like a tool, he asked, with no accusation and no relief, "Why did you save us then? Why hide us in 1995? The question hung there like a bell in cold air. It was not the kind of question that wanted a complicated answer. It wanted the truth of a man living with the consequences of a younger mercy. I could have said many things, that I was lonely that winter, that I could not abide cruelty, that it felt like the right thing at the time. But what I said was smaller and more honest, because it was the thing I knew how to do. He listened, and then he pressed his large, warm hand against my palm. The gesture was not one of dominance. It was like an appointment being noted. "Then you will see," he said, "what your doing makes." His voice was low, and the phrase was neither boast nor curse. It had the weight of an account book. We did not know then what "see" would mean. We only knew that hiding would become an act that would follow us like a shadow. We did not know how long the shadow would live, or what it would ask of us. There was nothing about foresight in the making of that decision. There was only the immediate arithmetic of shelter versus exposure and the way a child's small hand had once curled around mine. A week later I found new prints on the ridge. They were not mine. They were not deer or bear. They were the size of a man's palm, but set at strange angles, as if someone took the measure of the world by different rules. I traced them with a gloved finger and felt something like terror, the kind that is less about danger and more about the sudden announcement that the hiding place is no longer private. That night, as I filled thermoses and rearranged blankets, the town's lights blinked in the distance like a circuit of indifferent stars. My choices felt like a slow column of dominoes. Somewhere, someone was on the road. The secret we had buried in '95 was beginning to press toward the surface. I stayed up late, listening to the stove and to the low, habitual noises of creatures that were both family and other. Little Bit sat on a crate and whistled an odd, low tune that might have been a lullaby. Reed slept in the crook of morning's arm and made a small noise that braided me in guilt and hope. I thought of the ledger of my life and of the way a single choice could expand until it folded the horizon. And then, near dawn, a vehicle came up the lane, and the tires were too heavy for the snow. The world made a noise like a lid being removed. I stepped outside, breath smoking, and looked down the road to see a truck idling at the bend. The silhouette in the driver's seat was unmistakable to any man who had a friend in the valley: Dale. He leaned back, one leg on the dash, and his hand tapped the steering wheel in a rhythm that said he had nothing to lose. I had a breath in me that tasted like iron and unmade promises. The day was about to demand a different kind of answer than the one I had given when I put a blanket around a small body in 1974. The secret we had hidden in 1995 had weight enough to change the line of my life. Now something outside my control was stepping toward that line with measured, human certainty. I closed the door and felt the hush of the house fold around me. Inside the shed, little bits stirred. Reed made a soft sound. Sarah stood in the kitchen with a look that had the shape of resignation. We had chosen. The morning outside had chosen to test that choice. Dale's truck sat like a blot of oil at the bend, engine idling slow. He took his time, as if deliberation could dress what he was about to do. He came up the walk in a slow, easy way, one hand on the steering wheel, the other in his coat pocket, like a man who'd come to ask for a favor and decided halfway he might as well take the favor and whatever else lay on the porch. He didn't knock. He called my name instead, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. The tone in his voice was casual, but there was an edge to it, a tautness that made me think the beer had warmed something inside him he hadn't known how to settle. I opened the door with my hands still smelling of oil and wood smoke. The light caught his eyes, and the smile he wore didn't reach them. He looked around, at the porch, at the stacked firewood, at the kid's wagon leaning against the railing. I imagine, even then, his mind was counting things he could trade for a story at the bar. "Mornin', Pat," he said. "You seen anything odd up by your ridge?" There is 1,000 ways to answer a question like that, and almost all of them are cunning. You can hedge, you can ask for clarification, you can put your shoulder into a denial like it's a plank. That morning I had none of the tricks. My breath came like a small bell. I kept my voice too even. Tracks, maybe, nothing worth reading. He laughed, the kind of laugh that means a man thinks he's found something clever. Then he stepped off the boardwalk and into the yard as if drawn by some calculation. He walked toward the side of the shop where the dog used to bury bones, and where we'd stacked odds and ends. He leaned in close to the ground and ran his gloved fingers through a line of crisp, dark prints that led under the stack of lumber. The prints were there like punctuation, huge as a man's hand, set at odd angles. He crouched and frowned, the face he made when a horse misbehaves. I could see the way his jaw worked. He looked up at me with a quick, eager grin, and then, before I could move, he said the thing that shuffled my blood in a way no winter ever had. "You got something out back," he said, like a bear, only wrong. "You been hiding a bit of something, Carter." The lies I'd been rehearsing thinned and tore. There was a pulpy sound in my throat, and for a second I thought I might be sick. Somewhere on the ridge a jay threw up a ragged note, and the world went on turning like a wheel that knew nothing of the finer points of morality. "Dale," I said, slow, "you've been out in the sun too long." He smiled like a man betting on the right horse. He had the kind of certainty that comes from thinking the world has behaved the same way it always has. He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed on a phone. He fumbled with it. The light made the screen glow in the cold, and then he tossed it back into his coat like something he'd been meaning to check. "That's funny," he said, "because I thought I saw hair, and if there's hair, there's an animal, and if there's an animal, well, you know, people get excited about that." He left without much ceremony, the truck swallowing the road in a churn of flung-up snow. I watched him go with the feeling that my spine had been cut and the wet had seeped through to my conscience. I told myself he'd go home and forget. That was the small, selfish prayer I offered for myself. I had no right to expect miracles, no right to expect the world to hold still for secret safeties. But people do not forget the tracks of a new thing in a town that loves a story. They carry tracks like gossip, and gossip breeds the kind of certainty that becomes arrogance. I walked straight to the shed, because a man must face what he has promised before fear makes cowards of them. Inside, Littlebit was standing at the small window, shoulders showing against the dim. Morning sat with her infant across her lap, a shawl up to her chin. Ash was on the crate, low and still like a weathered rock. The wood stove breathed out a patient heat. When I stepped in, the air was close with the boiled scent of roots and something sweet. Littlebit turned when I came in. He had that small, unreadable look he'd carried into my house that first year, like a man balancing what he knows against what he ought to say. He said my name in the same clipped way he always did, and in his face I saw a calculation much like my own, assessment of risk, tally of favors, the cold arithmetic of survival. "What did he say?" Morning asked in a quiet voice, his voice a whisper of linen. Her accent was not English. She shaped sounds like someone taught the language late and kept some of the original near to her mouth. "He'll come back," I said. It was less a prediction than an instruction to myself. We acted with the speed of people who know the margin of time they're given. We hid the extra blankets beneath a false floorboard. We sealed seams with a gloved hand. Littlebit moved with a grace that came from being practiced in small, urgent tasks. Reed gurgled against Morning's chest. The sound was absurdly beautiful in the low light. I drove into town with the truck's lights kept low and the radio muted into a hollow echo. I left a note on the dresser for Sarah, because that's the sort of careful cowardice a man practices when he is ashamed of being protective of a decision he made alone. The note was useless for the truth, but practical enough. I'd been at the station, checking an old beacon, come home as soon as I could. A falsehood is sometimes a shield for a larger necessity. I kept telling myself that. Dale, when he got an answer from the phone tucked into his chest, chose not to come back to the porch. He called Sheriff Anderson instead, a name that meant more than rank in our county. Sheriff Anderson had a kind of balance to him, the slow-sailed gait of someone who'd grown up seeing neighbors as neighbors and problems as things to be smoothed with time. The sheriff arrived before the sun had pulled its first light from behind the ridge. He wore a coat that had seen better winters and boots with a crease in the leather like an old man's smile. He listened to Dale's account with a patient furrowing of brow. Then he came to my porch with hands that smelled faintly of coffee and the town's business. "You see anything?" he asked, not as a man trying to pry, but as one asking a neighbor for the truth. I could have lied. I almost did. Then I thought of the faces in the shed, of Reed's tiny chest rising and falling, of Morning's knit fingers, of Ash's patience, and the lie would have felt like a theft. "No," I said, "nothing." Sheriff Anderson doled out questions like a farmer sorts seed, careful, not eager to waste. He walked the yard and looked at the stacked wood, at the lawn where trampled grass betrayed more than we'd expected. He asked if I'd been to the ridge. I said I had. He nodded and made the kind of note-taking that meant the town would be something other than ignorant. He left a card and his number. He said he'd have a deputy swing by later just to make sure. The voice he used had the tone of a man who wanted to help, but knew he was walking a line between neighborliness and the law. When he left, I felt the cold reach under my skin in a way the stove could not fix. A sheriff's visit is a small, large thing. It marks your life with the idea that the community's eyes might turn your way. It warns you that the town's complacency about the world could shift into a different kind of vigilance, one less tolerant of secrets and more eager for evidence. Back at the shed, the mood was taut with work. We moved things faster than necessary, the way people do when they hope speed can turn danger into memory. I allocated tasks like a man on a ship in a storm. Littlebit and I fortified the exits. Morning and Sarah made sure Reed's rations were in a dry pack. Ash sat with his hands in his lap and hummed an ancient tune that did not sound exactly like any lullaby I'd heard. He hummed to slow us down. When the deputy came by, pretending after-dinner rounds and a polite check, we kept small. The deputy smiled grammatically and nodded at the dog bowls and the children's toys. He asked if we'd heard any unusual gunfire. A lie would prompt suspicion. The truth would mean a chain of decisions I could not predict. I said no. He left with a wave. He believed us, or he wished to. Dale, meanwhile, had done what small-town gossip does best. He fed the rumor to the kindling. By that night, there was a shadow in the corner of the bar where men speculated on the delights of hunting something big and clever and rare. The more they talked, the more right they felt. The sheriff had to answer to them. He could not ignore the idea of a new trophy in the valley. Human curiosity has teeth. The night the decision had to become action, the town's lights were like stitches on a blanket. Ahead of us, the world turned colder. I slept in fits and starts. My ears were tuned to the sound of tires and doors and the small animal noises the house made when wood shrinks in its bones. At 3 in the morning, a light skittered across the kitchen shade like a moth's frantic flight. I stood and I dressed with the precision of a man learning a new liturgy. Sarah, exhausted and awake with the sound of my movement, did not wake the children. She came to the kitchen in a robe and wrapped a blanket tight around her shoulders like armor. Her face was a roadmap of every argument and every embrace we'd had in 20 years. There was wear and also the kind of resolution that surprises you when love shows itself as an action, not a feeling. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You know I do," I answered. It was simple and true in the same way the old promise had been. We moved as if the house itself understood an emergency. We packed things that could be carried easily: thermoses, tins of coffee, a small kit with antiseptic and plasters, Sarah's sewing kit, 2 little toys for the child. Little Bit and Morning wrapped Reed in a wool blanket and placed him in a battered pack that looked smaller than a sack of flour and twice as precious. Before we left, Ash came forward. He stepped into the sliver of light and pressed his gnarled fingers to my chest where a man wears the shape of a coat. He looked at me in a way that had no hunger and no bitterness, only a ledger being closed or opened. "You did what you knew," he said through Little Bit's translation. "We forget you nothing. We go now with feet that remember kindness." It is remarkable how certain words can make your hands stop. His gratitude was small and precise. It held no promises other than the fact of memory. I had not saved a species. I had kept a family alive through a season. That was enough, and it was not. We took the ridge route, the one I'd traced a dozen times with a pencil over topo sheets. 2 miles of paths that hugged ridgelines and passed through a thicket where branches caught snow like teeth. The night was glass clear, and the stars were cold needles pricking the black. Our steps made slow, soft prints. Behind us, the shed's light dwindled like a candle in a vast room. Halfway up the first incline, we heard a sound that made every hair on my forearm stand. The truck. Tires cutting an arc across the road. The sound was too heavy for the deputy. It was Dale, or someone in his exact mood, uneasy and armed with certainty. He was coming closer. I stopped and made us flatten against the side of a spruce. Little Bit put a hand on my arm. His touch was warm and steady, as if he could lend me the strength of whatever species had taught him to survive in winter. The forest bit into the silence. A fox barked where the slope thinned, and the sound was a sharp punctuation. Dale's light bobbed like a slow star. He drove by the bottom of the hill and then back again, the truck moving like a tide over the road. It passed a few times, and then, as if anger had been mixed into his decision, it turned and came to a stop not far from a gully. The truck's engine cut off with an oafish snap, and the world hung with the sound of timing belts cooling. He stepped out with a rifle slung careless over his shoulder. His footfalls crunched with the kind of boldness that thought noise was safety. He scanned the dark with a flashlight beam like a single accusing eye. "Hey," he called into the night. "Anybody out here? You boys got something you want to tell me?" I wanted to walk down and explain. I wanted to say, "He's hurt. He's not dangerous. He has a baby." But nothing I could say would soften the sheen in his voice. I knew the story he'd already told himself. There's something out there, and if it bleeds, it will make a good tale. Little Bit moved before I could stop him. He stepped from the shelter of the trees and into that thin, exposing light. He did not swagger. He walked with a solemnity that made the air change. He squared his shoulders as if preparing for a parley. Dale's hand tightened on the rifle. The beam of his flashlight found Little Bit's face, and you could see the clearly absurd misfit of it. So human and so not. a face that arrested breath. For a breath, I thought Dale might fire just to own the shape of a story. Then something happened that I had not expected. The gun lowered. "Jesus," Dale said, and the single word carried a mixture of fear and awe. He laughed, but it was thin. He shoved the barrel toward the ground like a man putting down an accusation. "What the hell are you?" Little Bit looked at him for a long moment, and then, in the voice he used for explanations, offered a short phrase. "Not for you." The deputy's truck creaked, and then the blue light came up in a swirl of duty. Sheriff Anderson reappeared at the ridgetop like a middle-aged angel with a soft mouth and a hard patience. He walked over, eyes trained on Little Bit, and then down at Dale, and then at me. "What's going on here?" he asked, and the way he asked made me feel like a clock being opened. Dale told his version of events, how he'd seen prints, how the hair had been forgotten, how curiosity had turned the engine on. He spoke fast, the way people do when they are trying to give an account that leaves them blameless. You could tell, in the sheriff's face, he'd heard his share of tales that stretched like warm taffy. He asked to see the prints. I did not open my mouth. Instead, Ash stepped forward. In the quiet of the forest, he made a sound like a bird's low call, and then a longer song that had no words. It had the weight of an offering. I felt the forest lean closer. The sheriff, who had worked these hills since he was a boy, closed his mouth and listened. He took in Little Bit's posture, Ash's low notes, Morning's steady breathing. He looked at me like a man who had to choose whether to write a report or to keep a confidence. That night, the sheriff made a decision that would be read in different lights by different people. He told Dale to return to his truck and to go back home for now, to sleep on it and come back in the morning if he still had a worry. He turned to me and said, quietly, that if there was anything I needed, if we needed to move people, if we needed help to get them to safety, to call him. He offered a phone number that felt like a rope. Dale didn't leave right away. He stood for a beat longer and looked at the ridge where the path swallowed our footprints. He spat, and then, with the slow gait of a man who had been denied the spectacle he'd been bargaining for, he returned to his truck. He drove away with the headlight dimmer than before. We sat on the ridge until our fingers went numb and the first pale band of dawn pulled across the world. The forest held its breath like a lung. Reed hiccuped in his sleep. Morning rested her forehead against a tree and let herself be a creature of quiet. Little Bit wrapped a wool scarf around his neck and traced the contours of a map with a forefinger. Ash hummed the low song again. When we finally moved, it was with the kind of deliberation that speaks of a plan grown in a night. We used the caches I had dug years before and fell back along a route that took us through old logging cuts that had since regrown into rough woods. The map I had traced a dozen times with my finger now lived in my head as an architecture of safety. For 3 days we moved. We slept under the root flanges of low cedars, ate salted meat and whatever preserves we could carry, and kept silent. The forest at that time of year is a place of careful light. Tracks would be covered in a day. We left false trails and scattered pebbles to mislead any pursuers. Each night, Ash would tell a story of places where his kind had once stayed, hollows under rock ledges, caves that smelled of bat guano and berry, places that had once been more available than they were now. His voice was a slow litany that held us like a prayer. There was no dramatic showdown. There were no dramatic arrests or hunts. The town, for all its talk, had the kind of attention span that prefers an immediate spectacle to laborious pursuit. There were men who talked bravely in the diner and then drove home to their wives. There were others who would go on telling the story in camp as if they had been present at a revelation. The real cost was quieter. A family dispersed, a life moved into a smaller and darker shape. We guided them to a valley I had only visited once as a surveyor. It had a stream that cut a soft line through the trees and a pocket of lowland that ran warmer than the ridge in winter. There we left caches and marked them in a code only I knew. 3 stacked stones on a stump, a sliver of bark with a notch. We made a small camp and then a smaller camp, And then, at last, one dawn, they were gone, into the vastness of a place I could not claim fully for them. The leaving was not a clean thing. Ash pressed a carved token into my hand before he went, a small bear-shaped figure whittled from birch that fit the curve of my palm like a memory. Morning tied a strip of woven cloth around Sarah's wrist. Little Bit put his hand against my face for a long, slow second and mouthed words that had become like a benediction. Remember. We walked back with empty packs and the lightness of a man who had escaped in immediate, sharp danger. The sheriff had left no sign that he would make a case. Dale had returned to the bar and to his stories. The town went back to its usual rotation of concerns: school plays, council meetings, a sinkhole repaired near the general store. People did not want to be burdened by the knowledge that the world had surprises that cost them ease. But the secret we'd carried into the woods remained in the house like an echo. It sat on the windowsill and whispered. For weeks afterwards, I woke with the sensation that someone had taken a hand out of my life. The carved bear sat in the drawer of my bedside table like a minted coin, both a talisman and a gilt. I would pick it up and feel the scrape of the wood under my thumb, and remember Reed's small, sleeping chest against morning's shoulder. Months passed, and life pursued its quiet forms. Autumn slid into the box of winter, and then the green of spring. The plant up the valley promised progress, and hired men whose boots were too loud for the lane. The town built a new grocery and painted the water tower like a smile. People called it improvement and clapped one another on the back for the good sense of enterprise. One morning, in a small and ordinary way, something arrived. It was a carved figure, no larger than a thumb, placed on the living room windowsill. Smooth and dark, it was crafted as precisely as a coin, and there was a little note wrapped around it in birch bark. The note was not long, but it carried a language of geometry I wouldn't claim to translate perfectly. Little Bit, who still used those clipped, exact words for the things that mattered, read it and then turned to me. "It says," he told me, "we live." It was the most emphatic, least dramatic report I'd heard. There was no triumph in it. There was an announcement. They had survived the winter. They had found a valley with enough water and enough hiding to let them keep going. The carved figure was a thank you and a charge. The birchbark mark was a map of gratitude. I kept the figure on the windowsill for years. It lived there through the tremors of family life. Scraped knees, the growth of children into teenagers, the day Emma left for a college a few towns over, the time Jake fixed the vintage radio and set it humming like a living thing. Each morning the carved bear looked out at the road, and the way the snow gathered in the slow, patient way of seasons passing. Time does for you what no argument can. It makes new people of those once-worn choices. The question of whether we'd done right receded into the same kind of quiet that holds old furniture. I told the children small, half-truthful versions of the story when they were old enough to ask. I explained as much as seemed proper, that sometimes survival comes in private ways, that sometimes you keep a secret to give someone else a chance. Emma pressed the bear into her pocket once on a hard day in college, and later returned it like a relic. Jake, who had inherited my small and persistent habit for mending things, studied the grain of the carving and swore he could see the hands that made it. And then, 25 years after 1995, the winter we'd hidden them and the choices we'd made, I heard a knock at my door that unstitched a part of me I had assumed was sewn closed. This next part is a memory and a rendering at once. What follows is my recollection of the visit in 2020, and because it closes the circle of what we hid and what we owed, I have told it the only way I know, as a reconstruction shaped partly by what I remember and partly by the truth I have carried for a lifetime. It was late afternoon. Spring had not quite shed all its gray. The sky wore the tired blue of a season built for small promises. I was on the porch with a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm. The children were grown and scattered by then. Emma living in a town 2 valleys over, Jake maintaining the old Chevy and a small workshop. The house was quieter in the way a room is quiet after guests leave. When the knock came, it was 3 precise taps, measured like someone counting to a small prayer. I looked up, and there he was, little bit, older in the way a man gets older. Lines at the corners of his eyes, a deliberate slow stoop that spoke less of age than of a life that had gathered years at the edges. He stood in my yard like a thing that belonged neither to the town nor fully to the wild. There was something different in him that evening. The fur at his temples had gone a silvered gray. His gait had the steadiness of someone who'd walked long distances. At his side, this part I did not expect, was Reed grown. Not quite like any human I'd known, taller than I expected, his shoulders broad, his face carrying the same geometry as Littlebit's, but softened by a life that had seen more sun. Around them moved 2 others, a small contingent, not a crowd, the kind you take when you wish to be private. I rose from the porch the way a man might rise to meet an old debt. The house smelled like lemon oil and coffee grounds. The radio in the kitchen hummed quietly. Sarah had come to the door with her hands folded, the years having carved into her a patience steadier than any sermon. "Pat," she said, and the use of my name was the same quietly astonished refrain she'd used all those long years before. Littlebit's eyes found mine, and for a second the years between us collapsed like paper. He had the same small, practical set to his mouth. He had not prepared a speech. He did not have a manifesto. What he had was a look that asked for a direct accounting. "You hid us in 1995, he said. The words were economy itself, no excess, no flourish. You gave us shelter. It is strange the way a man can be wrong about what will make a wound ache. I had imagined a day like this might be filled with reproofs, with demands for stories, with something like a trial. What came first, instead, was a quiet gratitude and a question that felt like a finger laid to an old bruise. You could have told the world," Littlebit continued, "and that might have changed years. You did not. We hid. We survived. We forgot, but we remembered you also." Reed stepped forward, and his voice, when Littlebit translated, was a single, precise thing. Why was hiding needed? There it was, the question that carried the weight of the title. Not an accusation, but an ache. Not inflamed blame, but an insistence that memory be turned into something useful. They were not there for vengeance. They were there for reckoning. I answered with the same small words I had used across the years. Because it was the thing I knew how to do, I told them. It was true then, it was true still. But truth has many folds. There was also a confession in my voice. We had been afraid of what would follow exposure. We had misread the town's capacity for compassion and overestimated the appetite for spectacle. We were, in the end, a small family making a decision in the dark and hoping we'd made the right one. Littlebit listened with the patience of one who keeps accounts. He did not press for every detail. He did not ask me to recount the exact sequence of caches or the precise routes we'd used. He wanted to know the deeper arithmetic. Had the world we live in since 1995 changed enough that hiding would be different? Had we stewarded memory in such a way that other pockets of life might have been spared? Had we ever told a single other soul? I told him what I could. I told him about the carved figure on my sill, about Sheriff Anderson's quiet tolerance, about the caches I'd revisited and resealed. I told him about the times I'd considered organizing others, how I'd hesitated because bringing the truth into the light risks reducing a living thing to a fact on a page, something to be scientificized or commercialized. I told them that I'd become a witness in the small way I could, keeping a record, carving a name into a ledger I never published, telling the story to no one and to anyone who might listen in a careful, measured way. They listened. At one point Ash, who had by now the slowness of one who holds longevity like a private ledger, placed his hand on my shoulder, and in the translation, Littlebit offered a single concept: remember. Then Reed, who had by then learned somewhat more of our speech, said something that stopped me. We come to ask, will you tell for us? Will you be loud for the lost? The question arrived as if from a small, urgent committee. I felt the scar of the decades settle across me. The initial promise I'd made in a young man's voice had served to shelter, but it had not changed the world. I had never been loud on their behalf. I had not testified to the council. I had not organized petitions or stood before other men and said, "Look, this is happening, and if you don't change your map, others will be gone." There are nights when a man counts his cowardice and finds it long. There are days when a life's small secrets stretch into a larger moral ledger you cannot argue with. I felt that ledger then in a way I had only visited in dreams. Little Bit was not asking me to become a zealot. He was not insisting on fame or spectacle. His request was modest and severe: to remember honestly, to keep telling the truth until it mattered, to refuse to let their existence be erased in the slow, polite ways humans make erasure. "Tell the names," he said, which sounded like a prayer and like a summons. We talked for hours. They told me of valleys they'd known, of places that had once been corridors. They spoke of more than the hunters. They spoke of machines and roads and the slow constriction of space, an attrition that is quieter than violence, but no less lethal. They spoke of kin that had gone silent in the past decade, of crossings no longer safe. They did not demand that I gather men and fight. Rather, they wanted me to be a way station for truth, to hold records, to bear witness in the smallest ways that outlived any ephemeral headline. I promised to do what I could. I promised to write, to keep the carved tokens, to be present at council hearings if asked, to stand when someone who would have listened asked what I knew. The promise felt inadequate, and yet it was all I could offer without betraying the ways of living I had been part of keeping secret. Little Bit accepted this not as a victory, but as an agreement between people who had shared warmth once and now asked for a different service of mutual respect. Before they left, Reed placed a birch bark note in my hands. It was a map, less a map of roads than a map of memory. It had notations for water sources, for stone hollows, for some places to avoid. It had a small line that said, in translation, "For those who come after us, know these places." It was a charge and a tool. They asked only that I not make the map public without careful consent, and that I do not use their coordinates for profit. That was a small, reasonable condition. They needed the world around them to remember that their life was not a curiosity, but a neighborly right. When they left that evening, the sun had dropped mellow and sweet. Their silhouettes lingered at the edge of the lane. Little Bit turned once and put his palm against his chest in a sign that looked like thanks and like blessing. It should have been the end of a long conversation, but it was also a beginning. The life of a secret had been transformed into a small, ongoing obligation. In the months that followed, I tried to live into it. I went to meetings I might otherwise have skipped. I sent a letter to the Planning Commission that was polite but firm, asking how new clearings would be assessed for their impact on wildlife corridors. I met with Sheriff Anderson and asked if he would be willing to keep an eye, not for trophies, but for patterns. None of it was dramatic. None of it made the papers. What it did do was change one small neighborhood of decisions. I learned to keep records and names. I wrote down dates and routes in a hard-bound notebook and kept it in the top drawer of my desk where the carved bear slept. People ask me if anything changed. They want the straight line. Did the town stop development? Did law books enshrine protection? The answer is complicated, more a patchwork than a sweep. Some projects were rerouted after environmental reviews. A fence was erected in one particularly thin strip of clearing. A few hunters in the region were fined for illegal baits and traps, incidents that had existed in the margins before anyone noticed. The plant expanded, yes, but slightly less than planned. The world did not pivot on a single man's witness. It is stubborn in its appetite. But my small actions were like a series of pebbles cast into a wide, slow pond. The ripples were subtle but real. There is, however, a part of the story that is only now clear after these decades. Keeping their existence secret in 1995 was, in a way, also a way of protecting a dwindled place. But secrecy is a double-edged gift. It saved immediate lives, but also limited the possibility that the larger public might learn to care and, in time, to act differently. That is not something I say lightly. It is the kind of truth I met on the porch with Littlebit in 2020. And it is the kind of truth you only understand when you see the faces of those you promised to save and realize how much the world has asked them to hide. The carved tokens continued to arrive over the years, small gifts placed on the sill, a birchbark pictograph tucked under a jar of preserves, an anonymous bundle of cranberries left one autumn. They were not trophies, they were appointments, reminders that we had agreed to remember each other. People will ask incredulously, why tell this now? Why now, when internet cynics and skeptical voices will try to file it into a drawer labeled wishful thinking? I tell the story because I was asked, frankly and plainly, by a creature who had grown up to be a resident stranger at my door. They demanded answers and then asked me to become a witness. That demand was not just for me. It was for a world that tends to forget in the quiet, polite ways of putting things to rest. If this story moved you, like and share, check the description for related episodes and sources. I don't end these accounts with applause. I end them with the small ritual of memory. I keep the carved bear on the sill. I keep the birchbark map folded in the top drawer. I go to council meetings sometimes. I answer a call on a winter night when a ranger needs an extra set of hands. I tell the story to anyone who will listen with a willingness that is not sensational and not defensive, but steady. On certain nights, clear nights, when the stars are exact and the wind has the honesty of an old friend, I stand on the porch and listen. I imagine Littlebit and Reed and Morning walking some long-off valley or sitting by a stream where the cold keeps the predator away. I imagine Ash humming a story into the air until the trees remember it too. In my pocket, there is the small carved figure. Its edges are smoothed by years of my fingers. It is not proof. It is a promise written in wood. We hid a hunter's secret in 1995. 25 years later, Littlebit came back to my door and asked me why. He did not demand spectacle. He demanded truth. He asked me to be a witness and a keeper of names. I have tried, in the limited way a single man can, to answer. If you're wondering what to do with a story like this, if it should be shouted from the roofs or folded into a small private book, the answer is both, and neither. Hold compassion where you can. Let small acts accumulate. Keep a carved token on a windowsill and a ledger in a drawer. Say the names of what you have seen. That, in the end, may be the only defense the quiet things have against being erased.